When I was asked to speak on this panel and I was introduced as environmentalist, I was, first of all, taken aback because I've never considered myself an environmentalist. I'm a leftist, I'm a proud socialist. I'm a labor organizer. I've worked in New York City. I worked in New York City organizing various workforces for about 12 years. I've worked mostly with care workers, domestic workers, most recently with nurses. And I never really considered myself an environmentalist, although I've considered myself part of this larger community in New York City, the left in New York City. I can remember years ago going to the Socialist Scholars Conference, now the Left Forum, and sitting in on some of these panels and just kind of eating up all of this really, really depressing news about the climate and thinking, we're fucked. But always going back to my work, really just doing what seemed very tangible and real to me, which, initially was the anti-war movement, participating in the large anti-war protests leading up to the largest ever in 2003. And I want to bookmark that for a moment as we are, just a few days away from the largest climate march in history. So the environment always seemed like a very far-off thing, and I think it's really important that we look at that dynamic. Why does environmental activism seem such an abstract, far-off thing for Americans in particular, most industrial nations? And when we hear from our brothers and sisters who are fighting on the front lines as an issue of survival, what can we learn from that? So it's hard to follow such an esteemed panel, not coming from a specifically environmental background, but I do want to talk about what I've experienced as a local New York City organizer, and I want to really implore this audience to take a good look at ourselves and where we stand as an environmental movement, where we stand as a social justice movement, and where we stand in the left around these conversations. So, in October of 2012, at the end of October of 2012, Hurricane Sandy hit New York City and devastated so many communities right in front of us. And for so many New Yorkers, it seemed like a very far-off thing, especially if you were living in Manhattan and not downtown Manhattan. You didn't actually see the destruction that was wrought by this storm, one of the biggest climate catastrophes in this nation's history. And I, like other Occupy Wall Street activists, we saw what was happening mostly over social media, and some of them are in the audience. We saw what was happening, and we met up with our friends, with our comrades. We shared it over social media, we networked, we organized, we did whatever we possibly could. We got out to those communities and we did what we did best. And we built this movement called Occupy Sandy. And at that time, I had no idea that I'd be transformed through that process of being out in the Rockaways for almost 6 months. I had no idea that I'd be transformed into an environmental activist, and that I'd be at this point where I feel that not only this is the most important issue of our time, but that I'm willing to transition my work as a labor organizer into as much of this work as I possibly can moving forward, organizing workers in marginalized communities, and primarily communities of color who are hit the hardest by climate change here in New York City. I had no idea at that time that I would be opening up a medical clinic in the Rockaways a few days after the storm, because there was absolutely no effort on the part of city, state, or federal agencies to tend to the medical needs of those that were devastated by Hurricane Sandy. And what we saw in the days and weeks and months to come is that some of the poorest neighborhoods in New York City, we're talking about the Rockaways, Coney Island, Red Hook, communities that were already devastated, who had just completely had the roof ripped off of them, both literally and figuratively. And if it wasn't for Occupy Sandy and the hundreds, thousands even, of volunteers that came into those communities to offer direct aid, mutual aid, assistance, food, clothing, sheltering, dehumidifiers, heaters, so many more people would have suffered. And I think that that experience really transformed so many of us into environmental activists, because we saw firsthand right in our backyard what havoc climate change could wreak on our communities. But more than just the experience that we had as activists, I think the most important and critical component of that work is that it was the first time that Occupy activists really had the opportunity to connect with low-income and marginalized communities. I think several days after the 3-year anniversary of Occupy, I think we can all acknowledge that as beautiful a movement as Occupy is and was, it was severely lacking in that connection. And as a brother already said on this panel, the revolution is not, and this movement is not going to be spawned from, the activist community, the white community. It's going to be led front and center by marginalized and the most directly affected communities.
Yeah.
For these communities, climate change is not a far-off thing. It's right on their backyard. It's right on their doorstep. For these communities, it's an issue of survival. Climate organizing is not a privilege for them. It is a life and death matter. And I think we need to look no further than New York City to talk about how we move forward as leftists to do this work. I was thinking earlier, I've been going to panels and rallies and marches now since I was about 12 years old here in New York City. Even younger than that, I'd say. And I don't want to be doing this in another 10 years. I don't want to be doing this in another 5 years. And I think what's so important is that the next generation is recognizing that this is a crisis of such epic proportions that we need to be doing more than talking to one another in rooms like this. As important and critical as these conversations are, we need to be doing work that is uncomfortable for all of us. So what does that mean in a real sense? I, like most of you, was really excited to hear about this climate march. I mean, it is turning into an epic event that I think we're all proud and excited to participate in. But I think what's also been amazing about this conversation around the climate march on Sunday is a lot of the criticism of the climate march. The funders, the lack of demands, the march route, and left-wing cooptation. And I know there are a lot of people out there who are saying, don't be a naysayer, that's exactly what the right wants, and we can't be divisive in the left, and that's all a crock of shit. We need to be very honest. We need to be very honest and very real with one another, especially if we all consider each other a family. We have to be very real with who is funding, who is organizing, who is leading, who is siphoning off the momentum from the climate movement in this country. And we also need to be very real when we talk about how scary it is for the big green groups and the big corporations for this movement to challenge capitalism. Someone said to me a few months ago when I was first going to these organizing meetings, and he said, this is where movements go to die. And I remember being so offended by that, like, this is such an amazing thing that's happening, and I won't say whether I agree with it or not, but I will say, in light of what we know about the expenditures around this march, that it cannot be acceptable that we are having a march and a rally with hundreds of thousands of people, and we are not challenging capitalism front and center in our democracy. statistics about where we're headed as a species, as a planet. There are so many others that have done this work, and they've done it remarkably, and we know that even mainstream scientists are telling us what we already know. And knowing all of that, how is it that we're still not able in the mainstream discussion to say that capitalism as an economic system is completely opposed, I hate that word, completely opposed to our survival as a species? So knowing that, and bringing that conversation front and center, which is, I think, at least in this room, this is something that most of us are already doing. How do we bring that framework to the work that we do on the left when we're talking about climate change? And I appreciate Jill's comments when she's talking about breaking down these silos. I think we have a very unique movement here in the United States where we have the environmental movement, we have the criminal justice movement, we have the policing movement, we have the labor movement, we have all of these silos, and the fact is all of these movements are interconnected, and if we want to build a movement that is a mass movement from below, we need to move out of these spaces. Let's be honest, these are comfortable spaces. It's comfortable to go to a panel and see your brothers and sisters that you're already familiar with. It's comfortable to march in a rally with some of those same folks. What's uncomfortable is having this conversation with communities that are marginalized, right here in New York City. I can't tell you how sickening it was being out in the Rockaways a few days after the storm and seeing climate activists and privileged white folks drive their cars into Far Rockaway, dump off bags of clothing, and then zip out of there because they were so scared by what they saw, that Far Rockaway and the entire Rockaway Peninsula looked like a war zone, with cars flipped over, an entire 11-mile peninsula flooded from the beach to the bay, from the ocean to the bay, and what that looked like, and how difficult it was to have to look those people in the face and say, I don't have any solutions, I don't have any answers, and in fact it's even uncomfortable for me to be here right now. But some of us did, many of us did. And what we learned from those communities is that they understand what climate change is. They just don't have the luxury to sit in a room like this and go to a panel and go to a university and talk about climate change. They have to put food on the table. They're living in the projects, the New York City Housing Authority. 60% of the public housing residents of Queens live on the Rockaway Peninsula. These are folks who had, at the time, one study noted that at the time the storm hit, there was a 65% unemployment rate for NYCHA residents. So when we look at a crisis like this, on a scale this grand, a crisis that threatens our survival, we need not look to the Keystone XL pipeline or the tar sands or even to New Zealand. As New Yorkers, for those of you who are New Yorkers in this room, look right at sandy, devastated communities and ask yourself, what did you do to help? And if you didn't do anything to help, I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to tell you there's still an opportunity to reach out to those communities, but it has to be done in a way that prioritizes those voices. I'm not talking about busing in Sandy survivors to the climate march on Sunday. I'm not talking about putting them in a flashy Twitter campaign where you show their faces and say, we're featuring Sandy survivors. I'm talking about the real, difficult, intense work of working with these communities, and there are so many ways to do it. You know, as a labor organizer, I always view unions as an amazing conduit for so many things, and after Sandy hit, we have examples of unions really stepping up to the plate, not only to educate their membership, who are those same residents that were affected by the storm, but also to offer the services of the union to really go out there and connect with these communities. One such union is the New York State Nurses Association. They sent out hundreds of volunteers out to Coney Island, Staten Island, the Rockaways. Those nurses canvassed those high-rise buildings and met with some of the most frightened Rockaway residents, Coney Island residents, Staten Island residents, for most of them, this was the first time they even saw a face after the storm hit because they had no electricity and they didn't even know what had happened because their electricity cut off, their TV cut off. And what those nurses came back from that experience feeling and knowing is that not only had they seen the degradation of our healthcare system right here in New York City in the form of cuts, closures, but they saw firsthand how frightening it is when something like a climate catastrophe hits New York City. We are not prepared at all. 2 years, we're about to hit the 2-year anniversary since Hurricane Sandy hit, and we have absolutely no system in place to do anything better. It's frightening. And in that situation, we have an opportunity. What if instead of cutting back services and closing more hospitals, which they already did right in Brooklyn with Long Island College Hospital, which served the Red Hook community after the storm hit, stayed open and served all of those residents from all of those projects in Red Hook, and still, this endemic issue we have of hospital cuts and closures and privatization. Long Island College Hospital is closed today, even though it was a critical lifesaver for that community. St. John's Hospital, which is completely overwhelmed in the Rockaways. Peninsula Hospital in the Rockaways, which closed in April of 2012. We're talking about our entire social safety net that has been ripped to shreds, things we've already been advocating for, fighting against for almost all of our lives. And then we have this opportunity where a climate catastrophe hits the shores of New York City. And in that crisis, what have we done to amplify those voices in those communities? What have we done when we have billions of dollars of aid coming to New York City to go? We have in New York City and across the Eastern Seaboard, we have again, with climate injustice, we have a massive transfer of wealth, where we have billions of federal dollars coming to these areas and none of them are going to the communities that need them the most. I bring these examples up not to be a Debbie Downer, but to implore all of us to not just look across the country at these beautiful examples of folks fighting back, but to look right in our backyard at what we are and are not doing. And for us to really say, am I willing to be uncomfortable? Am I willing to do the work? Am I willing to go out to these communities and connect with these folks who are actually on the front lines of climate change? You know, I was on the train coming over here, and I know how much New Yorkers hate the Showtime performers, which is kind of crazy to even think about. But a gentleman, an older white gentleman, probably in his 60s or 70s, got up and made an announcement on the train that about the climate march on Sunday. And I was excited at first, and I was looking at the reaction of all the other strap hangers, and most people, when he finished, clapped and were excited by his announcement. And at first I was happy about that, but then I got really angry because I was thinking, how many subway performers, how many, who are mostly people of color, who can't survive in this ridiculous city, how many people on the train look at them like they're disgusting and they're a nuisance? But here we have this older white man that got on the train to make an announcement about the climate march on Sunday, and people were clapping for him. And that right there outlines the divide in our movements, if you can call them movements. That we have failed as an environmental movement to put the voices of marginalized communities front and center. We have failed, and we have to be honest with ourselves about that. And if we do believe sincerely that those voices have to be front and center for us to build a mass movement from below, then we have to acknowledge that, and we have to recalibrate the work that we're doing.
You're here.
I'm going to finish here because I wanted to talk about some, how much time do I have left? 1 minute, okay. I wanted to go through some examples. Very briefly, I can just say my hope is in here locally there's, for me, promise and possibility in community labor alliances, for instance, in the work that I do. Whether you look at the pushback, the amazing pushback that's been happening in the South Bronx community to the further degradation of the environment up there. The fact that in the Bronx, we have the highest asthma rates, we have the highest infant mortality rates, we have some of the highest poverty levels, and yet those communities are organizing and fighting back. They're fighting back against Fresh Direct, which is going to bring more pollution, more contamination of their environment. And they're requesting of our dear progressive mayor that he not allow Fresh Direct to come to the South Bronx, a non-union company. As you can imagine, de Blasio still has not taken any action on this. So that's just one example right there where we can have nurses who are organizing for expanded healthcare services in their community, uniting with community members that have already experienced the worst effects of the degradation of our climate. And bridging those divides and breaking down those silos. So we're not just talking about a climate movement, we're not just talking about a labor movement, but we're having real examples right here in the work that we do of these movements working together beautifully. And once we've done that, then we can start talking about the work that needs to be done on a national and on an international scale. I want to bring up one more thing. I think there are some folks in the audience that have been doing this work. Right under our noses, the Rockaway Lateral Pipeline is being built. After Hurricane Sandy, Gateway National Park, which is national parkland, was basically signed off to Williams Transco, which is a beautiful piece of land around the Rockaway Peninsula. And despite some valiant efforts to push back on that pipeline, the pipeline is being built right now. And it is frightening to see those rigs out in the ocean. For anyone that visited the Rockaways this summer, we had one of the most spectacular showing of wildlife out in the water. There were bottlenose dolphins, there were whales breaching regularly, and here you have these rigs that are literally digging up years and years of toxins into that water. And the transfer station that's being built in Floyd Bennett Field. This is a very real example right in our backyard of something that's happening that's going to have a devastating impact on our environment. And yet, there's just a small group of activists that are fighting against this. After, almost 2 years after, and I want to give them a round of applause. So as we near the 2-year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, I implore all of you to get more involved locally, not just to talk about climate change like it's an abstract thing, but to get involved in real struggles that are happening right in our backyard, and to really work hand in hand with communities that are marginalized, that have been silenced, and are not as privileged as you and I to be in these spaces.